Good morning. The Ministry of Treasury and Public Credit and the structure of FOCAL in Latin America welcomes you all to the third and last day of activity. We ask you to give us your full attention so you can receive a briefing of civil protection authorities. This building has an emergency plan. If there's a risk situation, we have equipment and seismic alert system, minor routes for evacuation, and meeting points located at the front of this venue. The emergency exit is the central door. Thank you. Good morning. We're going to begin today's program. We're going to focus on our activities. During the first panel, we're going to discuss the Brazilian experience. We're going to be talking about liabilities, contingencies due to fiscal risks, and also legal affairs. Now, we're pleased to introduce the moderator of this presentation. He's a financial expert representing Mexico and the World Bank, Luis Barajas González. Thank you. I hope you're all having a great day. We're beginning this first session of our last day of the seminar of the 8th Forum of FOCAL. We first of all would like to thank Mexico, and we thank the former Mexican president of FOCAL during his administration, and we thank the former Peruvian president of FOCAL during the start of his or her term. I have the honor and the pleasure to be here with our colleague Heriberto at the panel. He's going to share the experience of Brazil. He's going to be talking to us about liabilities, provisions, accounting due to fiscal risks, and litigations. Now, Heriberto Henrique Vilela do Nascimento, pardon me if I didn't pronounce your name right, sir. I don't speak Portuguese. Heriberto is an accountant, expert in public accounting from government. He achieved his degree from the University of Brasilia, and he studied in the public administration school. He's an auditor in finances and imposes control since 2007. He's been a manager and developed standards of the Ministry of Treasury. He's the coordinator of accounting and cost of the Ministry of Treasury. Besides this role, he coordinated the technical support team for accounting disciplines of his federation and coordinated the research center of applied accounting in the public sector of the Brazilian states in the financial administration school. Heriberto coordinated accounting disciplines in his country, and he's Undersecretary of Government Accounting of the Ministry of Treasury. He's also a member of the Steering Committee of Convergence in Brazil and the Accounting Board. Without further ado, the floor is open for our colleague Heriberto. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much once again. We thank Juan. And thank you so much for introducing me, and I'm going to ask you your permission here, because to speak Portuguese, I've received an excellent translation. Thank you. And we've been having great translations in Spanish and English. The objective that we have is to share our case, our experience, and correlation to public accounting, treasury's risks, and litigations, exactly. So with certainty, I can tell you that we've measured the impacts. In Brazilian government, we have a process, and we're trying to adjust and adapt to and use NICS-SP. This is one of the most impacting these are developed norms that have had a great impact. We know that if we adopt these accounting standards with a crude basis, before we adopt the laws and regulations, we are going to continue working on the assets and liabilities. The accrued basis is leading us to adopt the international accounting norms for the public sector. We're trying to work and develop on drafting the standards. We've added information and we've acknowledged the metrics and the amounts of the liabilities and assets that we have. Previously, these weren't adequate. We have the financial statements, but in the process, Andres explained the process in the case of liabilities, public debt. It's something that requires our estimations or calculations of liabilities. Liabilities have had a major impact in our financial statements or financial reports. That's part of what happens also if we analyze pension schemes or systems. We see the importance of things. Today we're going to talk about litigations during contingencies or cases filed that also had a great impact in the Brazilian context. In my country, I'm used to saying that, we don't substitute the first regime versus the accrued regime. We adopt the accrued regime, and we continued strengthening the analysis of the flows that we have. Analyzing the flows is important. What happens, though, is we add important information for a broader analysis to understand the economic conditions of our republic. When we analyze these issues and estimated liabilities and assets, we had to consider that there are cases courts submit the resolutions, and when there's a litigation, we have to think about including these elements, and that's part of the whole process. When we try to deal with court resolutions, we know it's the conclusion of a whole process in court proceedings where the economic elements are estimated before, when the court proceedings start. We analyze the scaffolding of it all. Now, we see the accrued basis and we see the whole landscape and understand why we have to pay off a settlement in litigations which grow. And you can see they've increased. Our litigations have increased. We're going to talk about that later on. Before I explain the methodology we use, I want to explain the concepts that we've adopted that are correlated with NICS SP19, where we estimate contingency liabilities and assets. I'm going to speak briefly about some details. To explain the idea. Part of the process leads us to classify risks, fiscal risks, likely risks, and due to litigations that we have, we need to classify the litigations in likely, possible, and remote. Now, these three types are correlated to the estimation of liabilities, which are also leading us to analyze the law, the contingencies, and there's footnotes with greater content to explain when the risk is classified as highly likely to happen, when it's likely that government has to pay for a litigation, we ponder risks. So we have estimated that in our assets and liabilities, and it's mirrored in our financial reports. When a litigation is classified as likely and possible, we don't have to estimate liabilities yet, but the revelation of these risks are explained in the financial reports and in the balance sheets. Now, I have to explain right now the differences and what we take into practice, and I'll explain what happens in the corporate sector and government. Stakeholders involved follow up and track what's happening with public and private entities too. So in the corporate sector, we know that some adopt specific processes. So there's costs due to contingencies that must be basically functioning, and they work this way. The legal department of a company, for example, has to create a list of the litigations, classifies them one by one. They see the backlog in proceedings of each lawsuit, and they classify the litigations as likely possible, and remotely possible. In the corporate sector, we analyze these specifically. We analyze case by case. There's differences, though, which are important when we have to measure or estimate what's happening and how it impacts government sectors. We don't analyze each case by case. We analyze a bulk of litigations because there's resolutions, dissertations of the cases, and these cases have a repercussion that lead the authorities to review what happens with the payments or taxes that must be reviewed. We must review what's the backlogs, from present, and we have to do a retro analysis that sets us back to 5 years of analysis. We estimate the taxes, the fees, when there's a litigation that has had an escalation in courts. We have to see the general impact. We're speaking about thousands of cases that could be correlated to a case law, a specific case law. So we need to adopt the process to measure the impact and analyze the statistics about the likelihood of the case to have a specific resolution. It's part of the process. So we analyze the impact in our balance and the repercussions in general about court resolutions. And based on that, we analyze the impacts in the steps of the process that affect the paid contributions, and that is significant. We have to measure what the impact for the government, and we have to measure what's happening in the public and private sectors, as I've said. Here, in the case of risks, we correlate risks to their types, which are likely, highly likely. We have to estimate the liabilities when there's a contingency. There's a footnote that explains our financial reports that are detailed in correlation to the litigations and their impact. In case a litigation was not classified as high risk, it's likely risk or remote in its classification, then we know that there's a thorough explanation in the annexed instruments of the financial reports. Given the high complexity of the affairs, as I've said, we have to study millions of litigations and correlate them to an analog case. So we established a method. With a method of study, we can create a report of the financial stance of things. First of all, we have a method, we filter, we obtain a value, and for example, we have dozens and dozens of resolutions and or precedent of resolutions that affect the federal government. The legal department of government analyzes all the cases filed that are being escalated and analyzed by the judiciary branch that affect the federal government in litigations, and they select the cases which have an impact. I mean, we have to pay off litigations that cost us millions and millions of euros, or our currency, the royals, it's our currency, or we have euros, or the process is paid, and that's in our radar. We have to analyze and ponder the fiscal impact and generate a report, our financial reports with the situation. We have to capture all the processes or litigations in which the federal government has to defend itself because it's been sued by citizens. So we have criteria to correlate the case to a value. If we classify a litigation as likely risk, we estimate the cost of each phase of the process. We have the minimum risks and values correlatable. We have the stages and court proceedings studied. So if the court resolution has a court resolution and we're about to reach the last phase of a process, and if the resolution affects negatively our federal government, then the risk is classified as likely. But I correlate this comment to the next. We have to analyze the solid, concrete risks. We know that there are solutions. We can pay off. But there is a major debate about property that's seized or embargoes as a consequence of a court resolution. We have to see the impacts and the effects that happen or are materialized after a resolution is submitted by the authorities. There's merits to analyze, embargoes to analyze, seized property to analyze. There's issues that still pen specific criteria. There's resolutions that need to be executed. So we classify risks, as I've said, as likely. After the assessment of a feasible embargo case, we have to decide upon matters, and there's a merit analysis and merit resolutions. So afterwards, we have to decide how to estimate the effects and the impacts, as I've said. That's part of what we're having in Brazil as a debate. There's rulings, cases, or lawsuits that could take years and years, and collecting or finding a settlement is something that happens when there's a resolution. So the risk is classified as likely. As I've said, we estimate and acknowledge the estimation as a liability, and after we value the assets that were object of an embargo, there's a sentence that executes the ruling, and it becomes now mandatory. However, what's a mandate, whatever's part of the mandate in its execution phase needs to be calculated. So we have to also estimate the impacts and see what's happening with the population who's affected and who could be awarded that resource. So the classifications, as I've said, have been measured. There's liabilities. If the risk is concrete, we need to estimate the impacts for the authorities to execute. So in the case of a case, if there's a case file being classified as a possible risk of materialization, there's no clear court resolution. So when a litigation ruling doesn't favor us, the resource is still something that we have to value. In the latter instances of proceeding, the results could be classified as possible risks. If a resolution is negative for government, the likelihood of the situation could be reclassification. Once we value the embargo ruling, we'll see the effects of the trial, and then there's the phase of execution over a liability, okay? So, for us to calculate the amounts, it's possible for us to simply find a way to settle a litigation. There's redress, and it's either there's pending payments or due payments due to litigations, and we have to compensate or redress. Because in correlation to the risks, we know that certain companies have been awarded credits, and there's ways to compensate whatever each party owes. So there's fees to pay. All of these payments have an effect when there's a litigation ruling, and this has an impact. So we might lose revenue because the contributions are used to pay those debts. And there's accounts payable from the government side. So there's impacts in litigations. There's payments. And there's, depending on the case, ways or formulas to calculate both scenarios. It's either there's a settlement or there's redress or compensation. With specific frequency, we have to compile all the rulings, dissertations that impact government. The legal department of government compiles analog cases that have been filed and sends the list to the Treasury Ministry to generate a financial report. This happens every quarter. We compilate analog scenarios or litigations versus the government. We map out all the cases. We have to analyze the court rulings. We classify the types of lawsuits. And we analyze the likelihood of the lawsuit, which is likely possible, remotely possible, or likely. The legal department has to contact other agencies sometimes to estimate the costs. And the Ministry of Treasury then is in charge of the estimations. There's a dismissed lawsuits, or there's lawsuits that favor government, and the process or the case filed is out of the radar of government, and we don't need to allocate a type of risk. If the lawsuit and the resolution does not favor government, then we have to analyze all the phases along with the phase of execution of a court proceeding. We have to analyze the execution and the impact of the court sentence that's executed. We have to think about how to correctly apply the amounts and the values to pay. I want to share this slide, and the matrix communicates all the numbers. In the lawsuit column, you can see that we have a matrix of data with historic risks that you can measure due to litigations in Brazil. It's very important for us to measure the impact and to be transparent. So in this matrix, you can see at the bottom the types of risks, the likely risks and cases year by year, which have grown year after year. We had to pay off millions due to court litigations. It's been millions and billions of payments. The total, you see the amounts in 2021, it's over 2,132.3 royal. So you see the actions of the judiciary and the legal department. We have to digitalize or transfer all of this information to the digital world for the judiciary to improve and to be efficient as possible when there's a litigation. Efficiencies have an impact too. We have to go through the process of settlement and analyze how this impacts the government resources. So the government's legal department might have been winning some litigations. That's what I mentioned, but the volume of quantified litigations have increased. And this has impacted government because we see the estimation of liabilities and assets during a contingency. We analyze the settlements due to court rulings and the impacts. There's cases that have escalated and kicked off court proceedings. Now, I'll explain the slide at the end of my presentation. You see the graph, there's liabilities, there's assets, there's payments. In the graph, you see the light bar in the graph. We have the liabilities of court rulings. We have the types. We have the specific liabilities, and you see the data. With this slide, we can also see the growth, the trends, and we can measure the impact that litigations have in our assets and how the settlements have to take place when we have to effectively pay. The payment is seen in the graph in the dark colors. There's 32 million due to payment, and there's billions paid due to litigations. Before we adopted a specific accrued base regime, it's all mentioned there in the reports. We know that we perceived that the cases were growing, the numbers were growing. And there's accrued basis information. What's accrued generates an obligation, and we must ponder the risks. So when the process begins in that stage, we know that it'll continue and escalate, and the judiciary and us have to monitor the impact of litigations to decide upon matters. Lastly, we have a table, and in this table, you can see the samples that we've studied to analyze the total expenditure due to judicial litigations or cases. We see the trends of growth, and the total expenditure affects us because we have to pay. You see the total numbers. You see the total expenditure. It's 3.4%, 1.8%. You see the columns of expenditure. Multiply it by 2. You see the amounts were doubled due to court litigations from 2014 to 2021. And that's what happens in Brazil and in our context. We have to draft new laws and regulations. We had to stipulate thresholds of court settlements and measure the impacts in our revenue. And the perspective that we've tried to deal with is the analysis of strategies, litigations to mitigate the effect. We have to conciliate accounts and settlements, and the I mean, the parties that incur in debt during a litigation are studied, and we have to cross-reference the liabilities and assets to pay the settlements of litigations that have been judged. As I've said, the amounts have been capped. As I've said, it's not something that's easily administrated. We have to study the court resolutions. The cases have had a great impact in my country. And after having said this, I finish with my presentation, and I'll be available for you to answer all your questions. I expect your feedback. Thank you so much. We really exhausted all the analytical possibilities of the litigation study there, but you see all the phases and the instances. We ponder the risks and the types, and it's concrete. After the final ruling, there's debates regarding the impacts of the rulings on our side. We have to measure the effects, but when we study the whole process of a case that's taken to court, there's proceedings. We have to classify the case depending on its types, and that's the last instance. Yes, of course, certainly. We have our defendants and we have our litigations and the process, but if we want to analyze the cases in the financial reports, given the fact that these cases are complex, we had to establish thresholds of minimum values in correlation, because if the minimum values are way under specific thresholds, it's difficult for us to keep track and monitor the results of the systems. Besides the risks, there's also a log that you have of the government expenditure, right, or settlements. Yeah, I mean, when there's payments due to settle specific settlements, I mean, if there's a process, we have to estimate, amidst all the complexities, what's happening with the payments of litigations and each stage. So we have a document, a report that has 300 pages, and we measure all of the expenditure per department, at regional level, at country level, at different scales. So we analyze what's happening, and there's a method to analyze the economics of it. Now, regarding that, there's some support instruments. We're being asked, okay, the question is the following: what's the impact of having greater transparency when we estimate the liabilities during a contingency? Because these contingencies or liabilities are generated due to cases or court cases, lawsuits. I mean, what's the impact of having greater transparency throughout the whole process when you have to study your liabilities during these cases, which are a contingency? I'd say that there's an internal effect. The public government administration measures the impact, the effect that so we have to continue monitoring the risks in correlation to litigations to analyze the forecast of the impacts. You see the court resolutions and what we have to do internally. Monitoring the process is important, and legal proceedings and their analysis are important. And also the phase of negotiation before the counterpart, when you're before the trier of fact or the judge who was there present in all the stages and has to study the numbers of settlement. It's part of the assessment. Now, there's instruments that in which we've made public the financial reports with the matrix of data and the effects that have an impact in our society. I mean, our financial reports of the litigations are of public interest, so the citizenship needs to know there's interest. There's a lot of interest in all the stakeholders and economic stakeholders involved in the process. I mean, there's investors that have also analyzed the reports and the economic reports of our nation. Thank you so much, Heriberto. We have one last question, and I think we have time now.
What is the coordination with the unit that is monitoring the fiscal risk? And what kind of information is required to be exchanged? Well, we established the requirement by standard. There is a norm. The General Defense Unit of the Union and the Secretary of Treasury are the customers of the Union. We are the stakeholders that are interested, and the norm establishes the flow. And 3 times per year, they report, and they have a layout with the topic, the description of the topic, financial impact, classification of the risk, and so forth. And that flow is set forth in the norm, and it allows the exchange of information. Okay, thank you very much. Muito obrigado, Heriberto. So there are no more questions. And with this, we will be finishing the first session of today. It was a very interesting topic. It is very relevant for all accountants. And it is always interesting to know the experiences of other countries. Thank you, Heriberto. And now the chairman of the FOCAL that will be leaving this year will award an acknowledgement to the speakers for their outstanding participation in this forum.